Welcome to Dynamic Discussions. I am Joshua. I'm here with Ty. This is our first show. We are extremely excited about it. In this portion of the show, we're going to cover Suicide Squad, do a little bit of review on it, and get a little bit deeper into some different things with film. Ty, Suicide Squad, what do you think?
I thought that it was just good enough, I suppose. And I feel like that's the trend for every aspect of the movie. Nothing really stood out. Nothing was too terribly awful. Just every aspect of it, you felt like they hit a quota where you're like, that's enough of what I needed from this movie.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you as far as like hitting a quota. You know, we had all these expectations, and it was probably enough for people to maybe see it again, or buy it. But for me, it just wasn't enough to push me over the edge. I didn't walk out thinking, man, that was incredible. We needed more Joker, man.
Well, considering the advertising for it seemed so Joker-centric, and all of the on-set exploits of Jared Leto giving his co-stars dead pigs, used condoms, all sorts of crazy stuff. I feel like the insanity on set didn't justify the presentation in the film. Like, I felt like a guy basically just had to lose his mind for however long it took for him to shoot his scenes, only to see all of his hard, insane, manic work end up on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, I've heard that there were a lot of other Joker scenes that were not put in the movie. If that's true, I'm going to be extremely upset. But as long as they put him on the DVD, I might actually buy it because he was my favorite. He's been my favorite in all the DC comic movies that revolves around Batman or anything like that.
For me, I feel like I could have done with a little bit more Captain Boomerang, just because he seemed unhinged enough and zany enough. Like, I thought he was going to be the main comic relief, but then he barely got more screen time than, not going to spoil anything, but one other person that died pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he maybe had 10 more words to say than the person that died that was in the movie for 5 minutes.
Absolutely. It seemed like they focused the majority of the movie on just a couple characters, even though there were so many involved, which was kind of disappointing. As far as success goes, it did make $135 million opening weekend in the United States. That is a box office record for August.
Well, unfortunately, that August record was previously held by one of my favorite movies, Guardians of the Galaxy, which it kind of pains me to know that the DC movie that most people consider to be DC's Guardians of the Galaxy equivalent ended up being so lackluster. Like, it didn't embrace the madness of the source material like Guardians did.
Good news, though. I think with the way Suicide Squad is receiving a lot of feedback and criticism, I think Guardians of the Galaxy, the sequel will probably do a lot better than Suicide Squad, the sequel. So, I mean, it could make up that. By the way, Suicide Squad did push Warner Brothers over $1 billion in 2016 in the U.S. alone. 17 out of 18 years now that Warner Brothers has been over $1 billion in income. That is an industry record.
Yeah, Suicide Squad alone, I mean, granted, it's not solely responsible for crushing the $1 billion domestically. It did account for $304 million so far as of recording this today, which is Thursday. Is today Thursday?
It is. It is Thursday.
But unfortunately, financial gain does not mean critical success, it seems like. If we're going off of Rotten Tomatoes, which everybody seems to go off of,
Mm-hmm.
It's sitting on a cool 26% approval rating.
Wow. That's bad.
Yeah, I believe it's doing better than Batman vs. Superman, but Batman vs. Superman was pretty bad, so...
And I haven't seen that, so...
I think being a slightly more desirable form of feces over another form of feces still makes you feces.
Yeah, I would have to agree. The Guardian gave it 2 out of 5, so that's not impressive either. It's not like Rotten Tomatoes just was out of left field or anything like that. David Edelstein from Vulture says, as storytelling, Suicide Squad is the worst of the worst. That is not good. But I mean, it is what it is. It made money at the box office. It's continuing to make money. People will probably buy it. People will see it.
It still shows a pretty big disconnect between the people that supposedly know how to review movies versus normal people like you and I. They don't necessarily look at movies on a fun factor, I suppose. It's more what makes a movie: cinematography, acting, script, editing, the stuff that wins you an Academy Award.
Sure.
But most people will enjoy an Academy Award movie, but I think I've watched Guardians of the Galaxy more than I've watched Blade Runner, and Blade Runner is a pretty good movie. I just I like fun movies sometimes.
Right. And it all depends, like you mentioned, these critics, they weigh everything as part of the movie. Most people don't go to the movies and sit there and decide, oh, that was a bad camera angle, or they could have got a better person for this part. I mean, they just watch the movie. If it's enjoyable for them, they like it. If not, then they don't see it again or whatever. But it is doing well financially in the U.S. and internationally. But China most likely won't allow it to be seen within their borders. What specifically is preventing that, Ty?
The main hurdle that any movie not made in China usually has to try and jump over is the State Administration of Press, Publication, Radio, Film, and Television. I'm sure they're working on some other fields to add to that because
That's a long name.
I guess they don't just want the longest wall in the world, they want the longest organization as well.
I guess so.
This group is essentially solely responsible for approving or preventing movies from coming into China. They oftentimes kind of base things off of whether or not it would slight the Chinese constitution, the government, the military, the police. They don't like the idea of disorder among the people because everyone points this out, but China is a communist country, and that has some societal limitations, I suppose, for the people that aren't at the top of the heap.
Okay, so there's a lot of different things that limit it, and I mean, my understanding is that China has limited or banned rather a lot of different movies that are household names here in the States. Back to the Future, Deadpool, Star Wars, Dark Knight, Departed, the list goes on and on and on. All of those fall into those, limitations.
Yeah, with Ghostbusters, it's touching on ghosts and supernaturalism, which I guess is a pretty big taboo in China for some reason.
Interesting.
Back to the Future actually led to China banning all time travel based stories in 2011. I guess they don't want to have to use the gray matter in their brains to figure out time travel paradoxes.
Okay.
Deadpool, if you've seen it, it's basically everything that China hates in a movie aside from spiritualism and supernaturalism.
Right.
Star Wars, it was initially banned, and it's important to note that this is the first Star Wars movie. Force Awakens did pretty well in China, but the 1977 Star Wars film had the misfortune of being released not long after this group's chairman passed away, and he was against anything Western coming into the country. At that point, it was more about the exceptionalism of China as a whole and ignoring everything else going on in the world. China's number one, everyone else irrelevant.
Right, and if you told me the other night that he was the person that made the call on Star Wars, right? And everyone was just kind of following his lead.
Pretty much. It would have been banned had he lived, but the fact that he died, they had a cause that they were able to take up. This
Okay.
guy wanted this movie to be banned. If we allow the movie in 4 months after he died, or however long it was, we're doing a dishonor to this man. So him dying was almost the nail in the coffin for the 1977 original Star Wars movie coming out. Dark Knight, the studio, Warner Brothers, same studio we were talking about with Suicide Squad, they didn't even bother giving it to the Chinese giving it to this Chinese group to review it because they knew they were screwed.
They didn't even try.
Yeah, and I think that might be one of the worst things about this group having control over what comes into the country. It forces American studios, mostly, also other international studios, but mostly American studios, to specifically consider a way of making a movie because they want some of that sweet, sweet Chinese box office. And if
Sure.
they don't adhere to the rules, like I said, pretty loose rules to begin with, but if they don't try and appease these 37 people that are dictating what comes into the country, they could take a pretty big hit financially.
Sure, and that's why this is so relevant. United States and Canada combine for 28% or $11.1 billion in the full movie box office market. Internationally, 72% or 27.2 billion. Now that's kind of understandable. Internationally is a lot larger than here in the States, right?
Yeah.
Domestically. However, the bigger number that stands out to me is China's gross earnings increased 49% in 2015, or 6.8 billion, and that is 6.8 billion American U.S. dollars. The next closest was UK at 1.9 billion. Now that is a huge, huge difference when we're talking about, is this movie going to be released just in the United States, or like you mentioned, are they going to get that, chunk of the Chinese box office and even just make a portion of it?
Exactly. Whenever the Chinese box office is accounting for 6.8 billion of 27.2 billion in 2015, that's a pretty big chunk of money.
That's huge.
I mean, China alone has the potential. If you can, China alone has the potential of greenlighting sequels if they're successful enough. I mean, if I were to ask you what is the highest grossing movie made in America, released in China, what would you say?
I don't know.
Fast and Furious 7.
Ah, nice. Okay, that's interesting.
So I mean, they like the senseless fun. So in theory, Suicide Squad isn't necessarily as fun or a 1-to-1 comparison to Fast and Furious 7, but you could make an argument that both those movies are fun movies.
Sure.
Kind of senseless.
Yeah.
So even if it only made 100 million in China, that's still a pretty big success story.
Oh, I would completely agree. Going back to success, that's how we got on this subject. Success of Suicide Squad. And we determined, here in the States so far, it has been successful. You mentioned it's made $300 million on a $175 million budget already, and it's still going to be in theaters for quite some time. But now looking at the Chinese movie market, I mean, really, what's it going to do over there, if anything, right? Even if they would make half of what they've made here, that's another 100 million, 150 million or so, so far. Needless to say, China plays a huge part in the movie earnings at the box office. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. They're hurting their country as far as income goes. They're hurting the movie income specifically, which, what's it to them? And the Chinese people, they should be able to see these movies if they want.
It's also generating an ugly underbelly of pirated movies coming out in China. To say that Suicide Squad will never be released in China isn't completely accurate. I would be willing to bet money that there are Suicide Squad pirated DVDs all over the Chinese streets right now. Like, they figure out a way to get these movies to begin with. So China's almost indirectly feeding into the demand of pirated material, which is one of the big causes Hollywood's currently fighting. Music industry tried to fight pirated material, they'd more or less lost. The movie industry can't suffer the same blow that the music industry suffered.
I would have to agree. I mean, there's kids out there, there's people out there that already have the movie on the streets probably. We'll see what happens. It's going to be interesting, but overall, I think we've determined that Suicide Squad was just good enough. It was successful here in the States, but that has yet to be seen internationally, and China is a big factor in that. Once again, thank you for listening to Dynamic Discussion. The links to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Gmail are all below.